Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today on this lovely afternoon. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and I think I have one of the best jobs in the world. I get to introduce incredible authors, meet them, hear the discussions. So it's just, I can't think of anything I would rather do than be here introducing, especially an event with such distinguished writers. The writers that we have on stage today. It's a little intimidating for me, actually. We have writer, editor, and seminar leader Valerie Andrews, specializing in and she's specializing in Jungian psychology and the inner life of home. She's the editor of Sanctuary and creator of the digital magazine Reinventing Home, where these essays first appeared. So she's the one behind this anthology that, as Phil says, considers our modern challenges of rootlessness, lack of time, loss of place, a timely meditation on our sense of longing and belonging and our search for home wherever we can find it. So that leads me to Phil Cuisino right here. He's one of the two. He is one of the two contributors that we have with us today. Phil is a longtime valued friend of Book Passage. He has been with us so many years, supporting us through our travel writing conference and discussing his books. And we are so grateful to you for your friendship to us. He is a freelance writer, documentary filmmaker, independent scholar, worldwide lecturer, storyteller, and creativity consultant. I like that he's a frequent traveler and a life learner. That's how I think of Phil. His latest book is Who Stole the Arms of the Venus de Milo? And that's right up here. um, Also joining us today is Mary Reynolds Thompson. She's the founder. Thank you. She is the founder of Live Your Wild Soul Story. She's an award-winning author, internationally recognized speaker, and a facilitator of poetry and journal therapy. She's the author of The Way of the Wild Soul Woman and Reclaiming the Wild Soul. Her writings have appeared in numerous other publications and anthologies. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie for what I think is going to be just an incredibly stimulating discussion. Please give them all one more welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here today and for being interested in the subject that is so dear to all of our hearts up here, and that is the nature of home, what it means to us on an inner level. We have so many magazines and television shows about the surface aspect of home and how it looks and what you're going to buy and how you're going to renovate. And I've always been attracted to what happens to the inner life at home and how that unfolds. And I just want to say a couple words as we begin about why I started the magazine Reinventing Home, how all of these essays came about, how I involved all these wonderful collaborators, including the people you're going to hear from today, and why this was such an urgent issue for me. And I think it began with my 32 moves. As a child, I moved every other year, and I learned very early on that home was a source of vulnerability and resilience. And it's the place where things happen that you go into therapy for and you have to get over and get a grip. And it's also the place where you learn how to be who you are in the world, because it's a place, hopefully, where you can be your most authentic self. So this is really the theme of Sanctuary. It's about authenticity, it's about connection, it's about community, it's about belonging. And these essays, as I said, first appeared in a digital magazine that I started called Reinventing Home. Reinventing Home is a nonprofit venture, and it was launched just before the pandemic. Talk about having an intuition that everything was about to change. And in Reinventing Home, we looked at three different aspects of home in every issue. One was character, how our character is shaped and formed at home, beginning in childhood and going for the rest of our lives. We unfold as who we are, and our identity unfolds in the privacy of home where we feel safe and connected. And the second aspect, okay, we have culture, creativity, and character are the three aspects that we consider in this book. We have experts from a variety of fields, from psychology, and including our dear friend Jean Bolin in the front row here, who has contributed a marvelous essay on why activists need home and how it's important to have a place to recharge and regroup. And I just want to say that the bond I share with these two people is a home-centered bond. Mary and I share the sense of bonding with nature as our home, because in my 32 moves, I had one place I lived for the longest time when I was 5 to 12 that was a cornucopia of nature, and that grounded me for the rest of my life. And if you're lucky enough to have that one place that grounds you, you can draw on it forever. So Mary is going to be talking a lot about the natural world and how we can find our home in the natural world and how she found hers there. And then the bond I share with Phil has to do with how home appears in mythology and storytelling and literature. And his most recent book is especially dear to me because it's a personal story about how he found his home in beauty. So home doesn't always have to be a place. Home can be a cultural experience. So you're going to hear a little bit about that today too. So we all know that home is changing right now in many different levels. And the essays in this book that we don't have people here talking about today because it's just, we have 20 contributors to this huge topic, which, by the way, is inexhaustible. We have climate change that's up for everybody. Is your home going to be safe? How are you going to deal with wildfires, floods, hurricanes? The Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of cultural change has been calling us to think about our communities. Are they inclusive? How do we reach out to strangers? How do we reach out to neighbors? How do we reestablish some of the connections that we used to have growing up in communities? And then that sense of community just got bashed by everybody moving and mass migrations everywhere. And then, of course, there's the issue that's on everybody's mind today, and that's this new divisive politics. I mean, we've gotten to a point where we used to have the ability to sit and talk and listen to people with different points of view. And now, I think largely because of the pandemic and the isolation, it is very, very hard for us to come together with a communal sense of home and know that there are going to be different points of view and different aspects of every issue, and know that we have a platform and a sense of home that will allow us to not be isolationists, to not withdraw from one another, but to actually reach out and create a home together. So these are the kaleidoscopic issues about home that you will find addressed in the book. So I want to start with personal stories. My personal story recently has to do with animals as the soul of home. I lost my beloved cat on Tuesday, my 20-year-old cat. And for me, as an only child growing up with cats, they were my siblings. So for me to lose a cat was to lose the soul of my home. And so that's where I am today. I'm thinking about how the creatures that we share our lives with are very, very important too, as well as the friends and the family members. So I want Mary to start with her personal story about why the wilderness became so important to her and what her relationship was like to the landscape in her childhood.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you for creating what is just a beautiful anthology. Just so many different voices and such a diversity of perspectives. It's like a gorgeous collage that, comes together in this, creating this amazing picture. So, like many people, my life is a study in contrasts. I grew up in London, very much brick and mortar in central London. But when I was a baby, we started going to a place along the Amalfi coastline called Positano. And when I got to be a little girl of about 5 and 6 there, my parents really just allowed my brother and my brother was 3 years older, to roam free. And in that process, we came to know Vali and Rudy, these gypsies who lived up in the mountains in a shepherd's hut. And we would spend the night in caves. And Vali was this remarkable woman. She was actually Australian. She had this flame of red hair that she brushed once a year. Her greatest passion in life was a red fox. She was surrounded by animals. I would spend many a happy day riding a pig called Romana along the dusty trails. But she and Rudy and Vali filled my heart with enchantment. This sense that there was this way of living that was purely magical. And one of the greatest gifts that Vali gave me, she was very famous, actually. She was an artist, above all, an ecologist and a dancer. She'd lived in Paris. She knew Jean-Paul Sartre, Jean Cocteau, Django Reinhardt. You know, her artwork was bought by Mick Jagger. So there was this whole other persona to me, her. But for me, she was just this magical witch woman. And when she danced, it was as though her feet never touched the ground. She was like this moving flame. And one night she saw this me, about 6 years old, tubby, rather awkward. And she said, "Come here, darling." And so very timidly, I went onto the dance floor at the Bouc de Barca with her. And she said, "This is how you dance. You dance with the animals." She said, "Reach your arm up to stroke the neck of a giraffe and then the back of a donkey. Bend down to feed the chickens. You know, move and wag your tail like the dog, and you will dance." And in that moment, I felt completely at home in my own body, and I was graceful. And that began this deep love and need to dance with the wild, this understanding that when we are in relationship to the more than human world, something magical happens. Do I have one more minute? Or
Absolutely.
We're
So,
the other thing that was so important to me was when we finally stopped going to Positano, which was heartbreaking, Vali gave me a locket that she had made of green and turquoise silks and sort of parchment-covered lace, and she had put things in it that I was not allowed to see. That it was not a locket you could open. It was sewn closed. And she said, I must never, never look at it. So I carried that locket around as a talisman all of my days. I mean, it was in my pocket, and I would work it. I would feel it. I was constantly intrigued by what was inside of it. So it's getting a little threadbare, and I decide, well, it's threadbare. Not such a big sin to open it up, right? I'll put it under my pillow one more night, and in the morning I'll look at what's inside it. The morning comes, I look for my locket. I never find it, ever again. I search under the bed, I strip the sheets, I search everywhere, it disappears. Decades later, I meet Vali in London, and I tell her the story. And she just looks at me. And she says, "Of course, darling, there is, you know, you were never meant to know what was inside." And so what she put into my heart was this sense of mystery, that we are all living a deep and profound mystery, and that this sense of belonging isn't about knowing everything. It's about holding a place for magic. Mm-hmm. It's about putting roots deep into something material, mysterious and wild and unknowable. So that's my story.
Oh. All right, Phil, have you got a personal story? I think you do. I think it's Detroit.
Y'all must be wondering why this guy's wearing a baseball cap on stage. So, flashback for the film buffs in the room to 1890s. A young fellow in Brooklyn, New York, asks a young woman out to a ball game. And they're riding on the trolley, I believe it was to Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, for you baseball fans out there, and trying to avoid the Dodgers, which is the origin of that name. We called them the Dodgers because these were the fans going to the ballpark dodging the trolley, hence the Dodgers. So this young fella is flirting with this woman, and she says, "Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. Let's go and root for the home team." Think about the association there between rooting, which is the verb that we did not invent as Americans for our obsession with sports. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. 2001 or 2003, I wrote a book on the history of the Olympics and found out that there were prayers, chants, and songs, poems about rooting for the Spartans, rooting for the Athenians, for the Corinthians when they went to Olympia in the quadrennial, the Olympics every 4 years. So this has become one of my metaphors for the desperate need for home. This is one way in a very rootless, we've already used that word a couple times, a rootless world. How do we identify with our neighborhood, with our community, with the people around us? One way is to root, which means to sink deep into the soil, the identity, the story of where you are. So for those of you then who believe that we are too obsessed with sports, including, this is the Old English D, by the way, from Detroit, where I grew up. All right, we got some Tiger fans here. All right. I wear this abroad. You'd be surprised how many people say "Go Tigers" when I just walk past them. This just happened near the Acropolis in Athens just a couple of months ago. I heard this "Go Tigers" walking to the Parthenon. So I will loop all these together. When I was working on this, my book on the Venus de Milo, I have to tell the story first how she is found 2,100 years after she was abandoned in the gymnasium on Milos in the Aegean. So there's an immediate connection of beauty, athletics, but also rooting. And then there was a big fight to determine who really, does she belong to the Greeks? Does she belong to the Turks because the Turks had been ruling in the islands for 400 years? Or because the French soldier found her, does she belong to the French? This went on for years. As I'm writing the book, I get to the part 3 in the book where she's finally taken to the Louvre in Paris, which helped made the Louvre the most famous museum in the world, which gave them some ascendancy about beauty over the British, because the British had just gotten the Parthenon marbles, not the Elgin marbles, please, the Parthenon marbles. So I'm putting all this story together, and I have to, because of my double obsession with sports, I was a jock, I was an athlete, and art. Quick quiz. If I were to ask you, do more people go to sporting events every year or to museums, what would you say? Sports? Art? Twice as many people go to museums around the world than art. It's an astonishing fact. I looked this up in every imaginable site. Twice as many people, which means there is a hunger for art, for beauty, for community, and for sanctuary.
Yes.
One of the properties, the values that we will explore here up on stage is that the sanctuary is the place where you can be safe, where you are demarcated from ordinary time and space. You know, that's the origin of the word sacred. Sacred originally meant taking the architect, taking a stick or even a finger and marking a line in the ground. That would be where the foundation stones for the cathedral or the library or the museum would actually be placed and then built. What is before, in front of the cathedral, the church, the library, the museum, is profane, which means in front of the temple, in front of the sacred. What's inside is sacred. So my entry into sanctuary is the world of art. This is where I go for my peace, my calm, my elevation. This is where I can converse with God and the gods in the sanctuary, which is demarcated from ordinary time and space. And I think you'll see in the book, I have to thank my father for this, because real briefly on this, the whole obsession with this goes back to the early 1960s when my father got was a weekly Life magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And
Weekly.
on the cover of the Look magazine, April 1963 or so, was this, the Venus de Milo. And he loved it so much. I think I remember him blushing. Now, this could be the poetic memory at work here. But he framed it. He framed the cover of the Life magazine, took it downstairs, and hung the framed photo of the Venus de Milo above his workbench. So every day when I went into the basement to play ping pong, to play some music with my friends, whatever it would be, I passed the Venus de Milo. And in a mysterious way of art, the image sinks in. The basement becomes a sanctuary because it's blessed by Aphrodite. The basement is blessed by Venus. It's blessed by beauty. And now all I had to do was spend the next 45 years writing a book about it.
Phil, that's a beautiful story about how beauty begins at home and how you discovered it through your father. And I remember when we did our interview, you talked about how a trip to Detroit was not complete if you didn't go and visit the grave of your father and have some drinks with your friends. So I hold that story dear. I also want to add that the whole tradition of housewarming also goes back to the Greeks, and that was the sacred fire of Hestia. And the tradition was that the fire from the central hearth would be given by the mother to her daughter as she set up a new household. So it's not the welcome wagon calling saying, you can buy this at this store and we'll give you 6 months free of this. It goes back to something very deep and very sacred, which is the passing of that sacred fire that was in every home to the next generation. So, Mary, I'd like to go back to you and talk about how personally you have another wonderful story about how your own vulnerability got you to move closer to nature, as you said so beautifully in an email blast that you just sent out. She said, "Don't fix yourself. Free yourself." We're tired of going to be fixed and having a list of things that we should be like and the complexes we need to get rid of, and hopefully we will outlive them and outlast them. And sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. So, but in the meantime, what the hell do you do, right? So Mary's wonderful book, her newest one, A Wild Soul Woman, 5 Ways to Unleash Powerful Feminine Archetypes and Claim Your Full Feminine Power is the subtitle. She'll correct me. But this was such a powerful book for me, and I would like you to tell people how you came to getting other women to find that they have a home in nature that gives them great personal and psychological and emotional and spiritual strength.
Okay.
Just in 5 words or less.
So we've been talking about rootlessness, right? And so I think this separation from nature really has made loose soil of us all. And a lot of the anxiety we feel, the ungroundedness, the fear and everything is because this primary relationship has been asunder. So I think this very nice naming of this vulnerability that I was a raging alcoholic. So, and I drank from the age of 16 to 27. When I came to San Francisco, there was something about the beauty of the natural world that created such a deep tension within me, so much beauty outside, so much darkness inside. And quite honestly, I was going to go either way. But what happened for me is, thank goodness, I quit drinking. But that first week of not drinking, I was standing on the bluffs above the Pacific Ocean on a really, really stormy day. And I was so aware of being terrified and churned up inside But as I looked out at the ocean, I thought, well, wow, it's totally in turmoil here. It's slapping against the rocks, it's churning, but it's incredibly strong. And then this thought went into my head was maybe I could kind of be a mess, but still be really strong too. And I tasted salt in my mouth, and I didn't know if it was my own tears or the ocean spray. And in that moment, I felt this complete oneness with this great body of water. So leap forward to when I'm studying poetry therapy. I became really interested in the nature poets, and again, that dance between the inner and outer wild. And that developed into beginning to work with these 5 archetypes that I work with, of deserts and forests and oceans and rivers and mountains and grasslands, realizing that, and we have the archetypal genius sitting in the front row, so I say this very tentatively, Jean, is, this sense that these landscapes are in the earth, but they are in us too. And I had felt the ocean as part of me. And I was in time able to feel the deserts and the forests and all of the ancestral wisdom that these amazing beings brought to us as part of who I was. And that got me really interested, particularly on how we women, in reclaiming these earth archetypes, can almost bypass patriarchy because we are done with that. And instead of battling it like this all the time, we can just say, I am rerouting myself. I am replanting myself in the power of these amazing, amazing archetypes who I believe the universe is intelligent and has our back. And I think these archetypes have our back. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
that's beautiful.
Okay.
I'm wondering if you could tell a story about a woman who came to one of your workshops and had one of these life-changing experiences. I know you have
Yes.
many of those stories.
I do. I really do. So I'll just tell, I teach at a college called Hawkwood College in England, in the Cotswolds, quite a lot. And the last workshop I had there it just seemed people come to me and they're in transition. Maybe we're all in transition all the time. This is possible. But this woman had been in a very abusive relationship. And she had a young son of 14 years old. And she had been terrified to leave this relationship. In the course of the workshop, she bonded, she became aware of her mountain woman self, something really strong and enduring within her that was unwilling to be ridiculed, demeaned anymore. And she went back from the workshop and she left her husband. And we are in a WhatsApp group and we cheered her on and supported her. But also, I will say this because I really believe that in order to find sanctuary, we find these wildscapes within ourselves, but then we have to help heal the wildscapes in the world. It's not enough anymore to do the work in here. That part of creating sanctuary is taking that inner work and making it happen in the world. So another woman who came to my workshop became an ecotherapist. She'd been, no, I'm not going, yeah, okay, I'm going to do it. So people and women and men who come, I do workshops for men too, just stepping up into themselves more. When we do that and when we're at home in our own being, then we're at home in our own power and we have the capacity to bring our gifts to the world. So
One of our other contributors to the book, Andrea Wells, is a psychologist who started having dreams of turtles and whales. And she got to the point where she said it's not enough just to have a dream animal. You have to actually engage with the animals of the world. So she became a very important activist. And right now, one of the reasons she couldn't be here tonight is that she is in Africa helping to dehorn rhinos so that they will not be poached and killed. And she dedicates a large portion of her life to also the habitat of elephants. They need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles for their home. So the word home means a different thing to every species. And there's so much diversity and so much richness, and it might help us to appreciate our own diversity and richness to really connect in that way. Phil, I'm thinking about your sense of home with all your travels. I mean, there is a base note that you keep coming back to. And I think one of the lovely things you said to me once is that the best thing about traveling, one of the best things about traveling is not only learning all this stuff, but the moment you come home and you incorporate what you've learned. And I wonder if you'll address that a little bit.
Well, thank you. That's a good lead, good prod, good nudge. I've been traveling since I left Detroit after I graduated. Didn't even go to my graduation ceremony because I've been forced by circumstances to work in a Detroit steel factory for the 4 years I was in college. So I needed to get out. It was the most violent city in the world in the early 70s. And because I was a writer and I adored Hemingway and Joyce, many of the writers that I grew up with, I had to go to the source. And this brings up the whole notion of the second home. I may have been born in the Deep South in an Army hospital in South Carolina. And then we went into the family stories in the 49 Hudson, just like Jack Kerouac when he went from New York to San Francisco, 49 Hudson. And we drove for 2 days to get up to Detroit. And that's then where I grew up. So one time I asked my mom, why do you think I've traveled so much, Mom? And she said, well, isn't it obvious, Philip? Isn't it obvious, just like mothers would do? She said, it's because you were in the back seat of that 49 Hudson with the tires rumbling in your soul till we got all the way to Detroit. And you've been trying to reenact that all this time. I thought, that's a good mythology of any. And so I as soon as I left Detroit, this whole idea of the spiritual home, the second home. Have you, in the audience, have you felt this? You go to Paris, you go to Athens, Scotland, Ireland, wherever it may be, and you suddenly mysteriously feel at home. Maybe even more at home there than you do in the physical home. And arguably, I've been trying to replicate that ever since. So I feel, in some ways, at home everywhere in the world, just a little more at home in some places. And because I grew up with the story of the Odyssey, some of you have heard this, but I was about 10 years old, and the 6-foot-tall Philco TV broke, and my father spent about a half an hour trying to fix it and got outraged, and he said, Philip, follow me. And we is that the verb? Drug the TV through the living room, through the kitchen, and then my father kicked it down the stairs into the basement and turned around with his arms akimbo, that great old word, akimbo, and said, we're going to read out loud together now as a family.
Wow.
And we did till I was about 16. Friday and Saturday nights, we read books out loud, the classics as a family. The 3 children, we all read a page. My mom and dad read a page. And that's how I learned, or I was introduced to Homer. We read the children's version of the Odyssey and the Iliad first, and then as we got older, the older and older versions of it. So the notion of Odysseus trying to get home again must have resonated with me. I never deeply identified with Detroit because it was so violent. Remember, there's this thing where we can romanticize home, but what if you live in a violent place? Mm-hmm. What if you live in a place where you are afraid, which is the opposite of sanctuary? Yes. Sanctuary is where you go for safety to get away from fear. And it's where you are also, it's a neutral zone, because originally the sanctuary was where fugitives could go and not be harmed. Fugitives from war, fugitives from local jailers, whatever it might be. So I learned this sense of sanctuary because Detroit and the factory I worked in was so violent. When I hit the road, then I was going to places where I would feel safe, where I would feel elevated, where there was life in the streets. I felt home in Paris. I felt home in Dublin, felt home in Athens. Fast forward then to leading tours. I've been leading art and literary myth tours around the world since the early 80s. When I started with Robert Bly, anybody remember Robert? Kuzno, give us some more of that Yeats. And so this now I can lean into this important aspect of home in my interview in the book. Odysseus at first does not want to go to war. He actually tries to trick Achilles and the others. Finally, he does go to war. As we all know, he's gone there for 10 years. But he's become violent. He's a changed man. And according to people like Emily Wilson in her beautiful new translation of the Odyssey, because he's betrayed some of his own code, he's betrayed some of the codes of hospitality, because he has killed, he is not the same man who left Ithaca. So the 10 years in which he is wandering, his Odyssey, it's also a time of atonement. It's a time when he must change, adapt his inner character so that he earns Penelope again. He earns the bed, the famous olive bed that he has carved as their wedding present. Out of this comes our word, very connected with the theme today, nostalgia. Its root is the nostos, N-O-S-T-O-S, which means the returns. And this was this enormous body of stories in ancient Greece that Homer drew from. How do you get home again? All the stories of the wandering soldiers, the immigrants because of plague and because of warfare and so on. It's estimated, and this is Anthony Burgess in his book on the Grand Tour. It's estimated from the time of recorded history to the mid-19th century, roughly half of the people who left home never got back.
Wow.
50% of those who left home never returned because of war, disease, robbery, murder along the way, which is why when you left home, you always made out a last will and testament. You always went to the local church, the synagogue, the mosque, to say your prayers.
And you prayed to all the gods of the household to take care of your relatives while you were gone because you didn't think you would get back. And there's one other thing. I think this thing of war that you bring up is really important. Dina Metzger wrote an incredible book called The Women Who Slept with Men to Take the War Out of Them. And the idea, if you don't know this book, was that in coming home from war, the men needed to be purged. They were not ready to return to their families. They were not calm. They were not ready to return to children. They were not ready to return to the hearth until they had been cleansed through Eros. Now, Eros takes, 10 years in the Odyssey?
Yes, he's waylaid a bit in every sense of the word. 7 years with Calypso and so on. But so let me finish this last part, which is so germane to this topic. The word nostalgia, then, is not coined until about the 18th century by a German psychologist who realized that men, specifically men returning from war, were telling stories about how much they missed home and how painful memories, images, emotions while you were away fighting rose in you. So he coined the word using the Greek nostalgia, which means it's nostos, which is the return, and alge, which is pain. It's the pain of returning home again. Have any of you ever felt that? Going home for a Thanksgiving dinner? Going home for a family reunion, a class reunion? It ain't all sweet, right? Well, this names that bittersweetness, or the way when the Greeks used that word, by the way, it was sweet bitter. We turn that upside down. So we talk about bittersweet. But for the Greeks, it was sweet bitter to go home again. And I think this helps us identify an important aspect in this business of home. I do want to go back to Detroit, but every street corner reminds me of a friend who's gone. Aunts, uncles, grandparents. There's my grandfather's watch shop. There's the old Ford shop where he worked, and Henry Ford came up and the Henry Ford, tapped him on the back and says, "You're doing great work, Charlemagne."
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that side of home? Is there a way to prepare? Are there rituals and ceremonies that help us anneal, help us heal, so we can go back and have an honest conversation with friends, with family, or even with the home that we grew up in? Have any of you gone all the way back to your childhood home, sat there, photographed it, wrote a line or two about it, maybe had a conversation with your lost parents or grandparents? This is also an aspect of home, isn't it?
Yeah, in my workshops, I help people tell their story of home, and I take them back to their childhood. There's a wonderful book by a poet and a stage set designer from New York in the 60s named Joe Brainerd, and it's been the prototype for just about every important memoir by a man that I can think of in the last 20 years. And it's called I Remember, and he starts every sentence, "I remember my first cigarette on the hill with Frank Bevins, and I remember the taste of cake. I remember the first time my mother cried in front of me." And it's just this cornucopia, sentence after sentence, that he stitched together these memories. And this brings me back to my theme that home is vulnerability and resilience. Home isn't a static thing. Home is a process. We begin with a vulnerability. We begin with a loss. There is something that we feel we're missing. And then the rest of our lives, we try and find that sanctuary and try and find that sense of refuge. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up is that one of the reasons this book is published by Chiron, which is a Jungian press, is that I was deeply inspired by the work of Jung, who felt that home had to be a place of refuge from the speed and the stress of the modern world. And that's what we had lost. You know, we were spending more time before the pandemic. Americans were spending more time at the office than the Japanese, who invented a word for death by overwork, karoshi, death by overwork. I have worked myself to death. I've been at the office too long. And so all of a sudden everything got reversed. And here we are at home, and we don't know what to make of it again. I mean, those of us who have been writers and who have always worked from home and had a home desk and a sense of home being the center of our creative lives had a leg up. We were very, 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 very fortunate when that pandemic came around. But the people I knew were struggling terribly. So I would like to know what both of you have to say about people who are looking for a sense of home, who feel unmoored or just lost.
You know, a word that is coming to mind for me now is the word solastalgia, which is a more newly coined word, which means, the word solastalgia, which is a more newly coined word, which means feeling that sense of nostalgia in place, that for so many of us, we are seeing our favorite places paved over, our favorite woodlands cut down, so that we are feeling this loss even as we are here. We don't have to reflect back to something that may have passed. We are actually feeling it in the moment. And I think that that's something that really comes up a lot in the work that I do with people, is this sense of, in a world that is being so destroyed and so polluted, and the list goes on, how do we find that place of sanctuary? Because we're sort of constantly fighting to preserve those places that mean something to us, that local watershed, that creek, that park, that, we feel that sanctuary isn't something now that we just can even return to. It's something that every day we have to consciously work toward. Yeah.
A great question. I'm not sure we can find it. I'm sure we can make it. It's not necessarily out there because the world has changed so much in the last few years, partly because of the pandemic, but of other issues, the rootlessness. So I was in Athens leading another tour just a couple of months ago, and at the end of it, met with the sister of the prime minister, who wanted to meet with me. She knew my book on pilgrimage, my book on Joe Campbell, the recent book on Sisyphus, and so on. And she has founded a group called the World Human Forum, where they meet at Eleusis every fall. And so they've invited me back in September. I'm going to give a talk at Eleusis. And one of the things that has come up was this belief in the Greeks that despite being occupied, I think it's 7 different countries since the classical era in the 5th century, plagues, wars, 4 years of occupation by the Nazis, and so on. What has given some kind of cohesion? It's a word that the Greeks call parea, P-A-R-E-A. And what it refers to is the regular meeting of friends to talk about things that matter to the soul. Not to gossip, not just to talk about did Greece beat Germany in the World Soccer match last week or not. It's regular conversations. It's not just by chance. It's not by phone. And it's not what the Olympics are about to do with Al Michaels, where they are using AI to replicate Al Michaels' voice to announce the Olympics. We are becoming more and more prophylactic in the original sense of the word. We are being removed from deep feeling from each other. So Parea is one way for us to gather. This is a form of it.
Yes.
Right here and now. It's also a way for us to be active in forming sanctuary. If it's not out there for us, we have to make it. Does that make sense?
Exactly. That's what this book is trying to do on absolutely every level, is get people to think about how large the issue is and how this is in our hands now. There are so many things in the outer world that are taking away or altering the sense of home that we've had for centuries. And this is really a tipping point in the culture as a whole, I believe. So what both of you have been saying today about how to reclaim this and how to, again, discover in the company of other people is terribly important. And before we go into Q&A, I thought I would ask all of you to just sort of go inward and answer a couple of questions and see what words pop up for you for fill in the blanks. Home is where I am free to. First thing that comes to your mind. Home is where I am free to. At home, I cannot live without. And my notion of sanctuary is. My notion of sanctuary. So instead of a Q&A, I would like to invite you to share your own experience of home, what it is that feels complete and wonderful and soothing about it, and what it is that feels lacking or missing that you would like to address.
I'm going to take the liberty of saying that this has been a really sort of powerful and almost emotional conversation that I've been listening to, because I was one of those people who moved a lot when I was young, had difficult childhood. So for me, home was a place I didn't want to be, and I always found sanctuary in friendships. And I think to this day, I think of home as my friends and my family now, my husband and kids. But home, even for the last 30 years that I've had a home in one place, it's always been somewhere that I feel like there's always something to do, until about 15 years ago when I started gardening. And now my garden is my sanctuary. And so, but it's not something I ever could have predicted when I was young. So anyway, but thank you for this discussion. Anybody else want to share? Anybody want to talk about words that they thought of and the questions?
Hi, I'm Bob.
It should be on.
Should be on. Okay. I'm Bob. I just wanted to congratulate Phil on having a 1949 Hudson. I also had one when I was 17, and I felt very self-conscious because I couldn't put my bicep out the window so the girls could see it because the window, it's high, and all they could see was my armpit. That did not work. But the car was lovely. It had you may know this, it had a cork-filled clutch plate in oil, the smoothest start or stop you could ever have. And the men who made that car, and some women, I think, involved also, were fabulous creators and mechanical geniuses. This great car. It did look like an upside-down green bathtub, so the girls were not attracted to me with that car.
There is one at the Beat Museum on Broadway in North Beach in San Francisco. It's the car that was used in the recent film about Kerouac on the road. If any of you are feeling nostalgic for a childhood car, you can go see it.
Which museum?
The Beat Museum, as in the Beat Generation in North Beach. Thank you for that.
Hi, I'm locked into the word sanctuary as your choice to talk about home, and probably because I'm clergy, so it has a religious connotation for me experientially. But that evolved into a political use of the word sanctuary as safety for refugees. Our illustrious Supreme Court this week criminalized homelessness for the first time, and that's horrifying to me. I wonder about your thoughts about just even being able to wrap your head around the notion that homelessness is a crime.
I was very perturbed by that as well. And I'm glad you brought that up because we have no idea how these laws are going to be enforced and how brutal they are going to be, but we're in for it. We've had a tendency. I remember I interviewed a psychiatrist named Lloyd DeMouse years ago who talked about the boom bust cycles, and he said when things get tough economically, we sacrifice people. It's human sacrifice, and you can expect it. And I was stunned when he said that. And when I heard about the Supreme Court ruling, I felt the visceral impact of that, that if you don't have a home and you simply have a sleeping bag in a park, you can be fined, arrested. I find this brutal, and I think this is a place for activism around sanctuary and home. And I'm wondering what you two have to say about it.
It's just breakdown of community. You know, we feel as though the homeless are a different species. They aren't part of our community. And I think it's that we've all been talking about that in different ways is, you know, sanctuary is human community. And when you don't have community, it enables incredible inhumanity to occur. And I can see the pain in your face, and I think it's horrifying.
Yeah, it's the othering, not me, not in my backyard. And I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Somebody else over here?
So I had a question about nostalgia. So thinking a bit about the political context here and the kind of manufactured nostalgia for a time that didn't really exist, whether it's the great Trump years or the great 1950s when America was supreme, and unquestioned power and all of the associations of that manufactured fake nostalgia that is used as a lever in the political psychology of the moment. Putin uses it for the time when Russia was strong and the Soviet Union was proud and we had defeated the Nazis, etc. So you're psychologists, and I wonder if you've thought about the false nostalgia that's become so mainstream at this moment.
Well, certainly, yes.
How we cure it.
Thank you. Well, that's another event. See you back here next week. The we have to go for another word because of the obfuscation that's now associated with the deep sense of nostalgia, which is the pain of going home again. That's worth a PhD right there. It's in so many of our movies. We have a movie scholar here. You know that theme. You go home, but then you feel all the emotions come up of the unresolved issues.
Well, you're making an important point, which is that it's a resistance to feeling pain. That this fake nostalgia comes from a resistance to feeling and processing the pain surrounding home.
Yes, and because we don't quite have the word for that, yet often we have to turn to other cultures. So the Portuguese do have a word that comes much closer than, let's say, false nostalgia, which gets us in the negative thought. Saudade, Saudade, and it's a melancholic feeling for a time that may never have existed.
Yes.
And it comes up from the period after the age of exploration, when Portugal and Spain had divided the world between themselves. And suddenly Spain went on to great riches and glory, but Portugal, it's a wide statement, I realize this, but Portugal didn't quite have the future that Spain did. And so there's an aspect of Portuguese society that is missing the period in which they were one of the countries and cultures that ruled the world. So Saudade is at the heart of fado music, F-A-D-O, which has fate at the center of fado. It's fate. And it's the kind of song that would be sung by someone in a club in Lisbon or in Sintra, a deep longing for my lover who never came back from South America, a longing for the ascendancy that Portugal had on all the rest of Europe, and politicians since then have all used this to their advantage. Putin longing for a Russia that never existed, for an empire that never existed. The whole business of the far right's romanticization of going back to the Eisenhower years. That's your idea of a golden age? You can't do better than that? Please. But it does strike something archetypal. And what is it that's archetypal, right? The pattern there is when in doubt, when in soul conflict, you go back to childhood. You go back to fantasies of paradise. And so much of the pilgrimage mythology, so much of our movie mythology is going back to a place that is usually shot in gold, amber, late after what they call the golden hour light. That's the shadow side of Sanctuary. We're trying to evoke a sense of what was real. Can you go back into your past and capture that thing that has fed you all your life rather than poisoned you?
Exactly. Thank you, Phil. Got two more. Have two more questions over here.
Oh, well, sorry, one back here.
Oh,
Sorry. The theme of Sanctuary is really resonating. Recently divorced, so my social home is gone, but I've been replacing it. I've been looking at what's been happening with climate change and all these fires, and people are losing their homes. So I'm starting a company to build small homes that people can put in their backyards, perhaps to save their lives. They're non-combustible. But the idea is a fire is a traumatic experience. Everything you know your whole life is ripped away from you. The fires in Maui, for example, is not just the loss of a home, it's your social fabric, it's your town, and it's not going to come back. It'll be different. So how to make structures that, though they're small, can support a feeling of sanctuary, especially in a time of stress. If somebody is in one of these structures during a fire and you know that your whole world is going away, how can that inside feel sheltering during and after? And so that's one thing that I'm really thinking about as I move forward with the next part of my life, how to build sanctuary for people who lose it. I'd also like to, with any profits I make, donate some of these structures to people who have no homes, to build small communities.
Thank you.
Address homelessness.
Thank you very much for that contribution.
This conversation is why I live here. Really, I feel right at home. I just wanted to acknowledge a person who passed away just a few days ago at 90, Bill Anders, who was an astronaut who took a photograph of the Earth from space, and he described it as the blue marble. And it was the first time that I think humanity realized that this is our home, right? This is our only home. So I wanted to thank him for that. And I think it's a really important reminder that we live on a blue marble and that we take care of it.
Can I add something to that real quick? I interviewed Stuart, Whole Earth Catalog, Stuart Brand, about this years ago, in which he had single-handedly started this campaign. He created buttons, went to Congress, passed out thousands and thousands of buttons of a drawing of home. And then it occurred to him, we have a drawing. We can imagine what the Earth looks like from outer space, but we need a photograph. So he went to Hasselblad, and they donated a $10,000 Hasselblad camera to NASA to give to the astronauts, which they then handed to Bill Anders. Right, and that's the famous Earthrise that we see now. And it's important to remember that when we have this on the third recording, there were 3 different tape recorders going when they were up there. Anders looks through the window as he's about to take the shot, and he says, "You hear the gasp? You hear the gasp? That's the sign. The gasp is the sign of the beautiful." And that's what he said. It's beautiful. And as Stuart Brand later said, this is home. This is the only home we will ever know. You see how beauty comes back into that?
And the gasp is also what differentiates between the false nostalgia and the real experience, because the gasp is that you are caught by utter surprise and something in you changes. It's not clinging to something that has never changed or that you think never should have changed. It is the openness to change and the openness to having your sense of home be recreated on any level. And this is the openness we need if we're going to have any kind of dialogue with one another in this country moving forward.
So I had the opportunity to read your essay before 1 o'clock. And the part of the essay that I was most interested in you further elaborating on was the psychotropic function, or the return or the change in the soul. Because you touched on it, but then you didn't really go into that.
You can't go into everything all the time, but I do go into it in the Venus de Milo book. We know the word heliotropic, right? It's the turning of the plant towards the sun. The origin, the true meaning of psychotropic isn't just to get high and listen to Pink Floyd late at night in the dorm, although that was an early function. Psychotropic means the turning of the soul. The psycho, as in psyche, as in soul, the turning of the soul. And for me, that's the ultimate and premier function of beauty. Beauty is what turns the soul back to the light. We are in darkness, we go to a museum. It's part of my introduction in this book. I was there at 9/11. We were landing in New York on the morning of 9/11 when the first plane hit the first tower, which I saw outside the plane. I had a book signing at the World Trade Center there at 11 o'clock. I was devastated, as everybody was all around the world. And my function, after being around all that death for 3 days, was to walk clear across Manhattan to look at the Vermeers in the Met. I don't know how or why, it's not rational, but that is the psychotropic function.
Yeah.
My soul needed some beauty. It needed some light. I needed to walk through Central Park.
Yeah.
There's a kind of rewilding of walking through the park, not down the streets. I walked through the park to get to the museum. And I want to say this is one of the functions of sanctuary. We need the sense of refuge. I can breathe here
Yes.
in this temple, in this museum, in my friend's home, right? In the church. I'm going to Chartres with Brian Swim and Lauren Artris in a few months, and we're going to have a 5-day workshop on pilgrimage. The pilgrimage of light from the Big Bang till now, the pilgrimage which they're celebrating in Chartres. There's 1,000 years of pilgrimage in Chartres. And we're going to be part of this celebration. Why would people walk clear across Europe, hundreds and hundreds of miles in very dangerous times? We have to remember that. Why? To be uplifted up towards the light so that something can move, something can change.
Well, you and I have talked about pilgrimage in our interview and in our private conversations too, about the notion of needing to go out and away and tell the person you're on the pilgrimage with. In Chaucer, this is who I am, this is where I come from, and then on the way back the discussion is this is who I am and this is how I've changed. So it all comes down to that willingness to change, and perhaps we can never really be at home with ourselves unless if we don't incorporate that sense of being willing to open and to change and to be in the world on a whole new level. So refuge, sanctuary, home is not a static thing. It is continuously evolving. And my hope is that all of you will keep evolving your concept of it and will create your own community and will consider home on a much deeper level after hearing from these extraordinary contributors we've had today.